Welcome to this episode of Brains Trust. This is the story about the Indian Navy. Due to our continental mindset over the last 200 or 300 years and the attendant obsession with our northern borders, the Navy as a service perhaps has lower salience than the Army and the Air Force. But we don't realize it. It's a very potent force. May I add that India has a very rich maritime history and tradition, and its economic prowess was at its zenith when its navy dominated the oceans around, and then we ignored it and its role at a great cost. While the Indian Army in modern times has a tradition going back to over 250 years, the Indian Air Force grew during the Second World War, particularly in the Burma campaign. We tend to ignore that the Indian Navy, which is such a formidable force, actually grew slowly in 1950s, organized itself in the 1960s, early 60s we acquired the Vikrant, did not quite participate in the 1965 war because it was restricted south of the Porbandar parallel. But in the 6 years thereafter, a young service grew, organized itself and delivered in 1971 operations, and how. This is a riveting story of what in the corporate world would be called a startup that became a unicorn. To tell this story, we have one of the finest officers of the Indian Navy, Vice Admiral Anup Singh, former Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Naval Command, and he will walk us through this fascinating journey. Admiral Anup Singh, thank you for being on Brains Trust. For starters, can you briefly scope out our continental and our maritime boundaries, because most of us don't realize that we've got such a large maritime boundary.
Interesting and important. India has a unique geography. Her northern frontiers present a land border as long as 15,000 kilometers. Even with Bangladesh, which shares the longest amongst all countries' borders at 4,000 kilometers, there is only a small portion of trade that goes across our land borders. Most of the trade is transacted over the seas. Now, this is because volumes and weights can best be transported over the water. It makes plain and simple economic sense. In fact, maritime countries are naturally blessed, and India, with the second largest peninsula in the world, is truly blessed as her long coastline hosts over 200 ports, entails a huge responsibility upon the Indian Navy and the Coast Guard as well, protect the sea lines of communications or SLOCs. Insofar as India is concerned, therefore, the notional seafront border is at 12 nautical miles, which is called the territorial waters, from the coast. But its significance is limited to the fact that the law of the land extends to those territorial seas. For a navy, this boundary has no meaning. And so the Indian Navy can traverse any part of the oceans and exercise sea control in the area of its choosing on the eastern or the western seaboard.
So that brings me to the 1971 operations. It is considered to be the Navy's finest hour. Why is it so?
To answer this question, one must go back to the 60s, which was sadly remembered as an era of denial, not just in terms of technology and modern hardware, but particularly for the Indian Navy, which was shockingly denied active participation in the 1965 war, restricted to operate below the latitude of Porbandar. Therefore, in the years following 1965, the Navy's leadership was determined that should an opportunity present itself again, the force must insist firstly on active participation with offensive defense, if not offense in its entirety. Secondly, the Navy must upgrade itself as well. The opportunity came just 6 years later, by when the Indian Navy had also completely transformed its force architecture. This was realized by the leadership of the Navy, which strengthened its resolve to firstly rectify perceptions of those in power at the political level about the Navy's role and ability to turn the tables, and secondly, to quickly find sources of supply alternate to the UK and the US, which had started denying imports by us. Fortunately, in 1964, the USSR had already offered its platforms and weapon systems, as the Americans had refrained from passing any technology, and the British had regretted inability due to their economic decline and their decision to withdraw from the east of Suez. Thus, all eyes turned to the Soviet Union, and supplies of brand new corvettes, missile boats, and submarines materialized at an impressive pace. The reason the government agreed so quickly for these imports was the realization that Pakistan's intrusions in the Run of Kutch in early 65 were simultaneously complemented by a surprise change in attitude of Indonesia, which, under President Sukarno, had started intruding into the Nicobar Islands and even offered military support to Pakistan. Over these silent years, as they are being called now, new platforms were acquired, infrastructure created, and knowledge management frameworks institutionalized. Between 69 and 70, a number of modern acquisitions arrived from the former Soviet Union. These included 5 Petya-class anti-submarine corvettes, which were named with the lead ship as Kamorta, 4 submarines, whose lead submarine was named the Kalveri. Therefore, they are called the Kalveri class, a submarine rescue vessel Nistar, 2 Polish-built landing ships Ghadial and Guldar, and 5 patrol boats of the Panvel class. By about mid-1971, 8 missile boats of the Nashak and Vinash classes were inducted into the Indian Navy. 1971 was therefore the Indian Navy's finest hour.
So from March 1971, because of Operation Searchlight, was a crackdown on the civilian population in East Pakistan, the refugees started pouring into Bengal, Assam, Tripura from East Pakistan. And it was speculated that there would be an intervention by India, a military intervention. And there was a large caste in the Indian Navy who were looking at this development very closely. And it was a very interesting cast of officers. So who were these officers? And what was broadly the asset base of the service as it looked at the 1971 operations from March?
As the refugee crisis mushroomed on the eastern borders, war plans were drafted, and it is full credit to the then chiefs of staff who worked in total concert for integrated, perfectly coordinated warfare. Victory at sea was achieved under the pioneering leadership of Admiral S.M. Nanda, then Chief of Naval Staff. The Flag Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Western Naval Command, looking after the Western Seaboard, was Vice Admiral who later became Admiral and Chief of Naval Staff, S.N. Kohli. His counterpart on the Eastern Seaboard in the newly formed Eastern Naval Command was Vice Admiral N. Krishnan. You see, the objectives of the 71 war, as defined by the Chiefs of Staff Committee in November 1971, were to gain as much ground in the east as possible, to neutralize Pakistani forces there, to establish a base, as it were, for a possible state of Bangladesh, and in the west, to hold Pakistani forces. During the war, the Navy fought in 2 separate theatres, on the western and the eastern seaboards, establishing what in naval strategy is termed as sea control in both the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. The Navy's ships and aircraft sank enemy ships, destroyed shore infrastructure, and subdued the Pakistani Navy. The effect of the Navy's contraband control of enemy coasts on both sides, closed trade routes, and import of critical war material, and particularly any avenue of escape by sea of the 90,000 odd prisoners of war who were to surrender from East Pakistan. In Admiral Nanda, we had a resolute chief who was committed to an aggressive posture by the Indian Navy.
So it turned out to be a 2-front war, something that we keep talking about now in different scenarios, as it were. how did the Navy integrate its plan with the overall plans of the Indian military, the Indian Army, the Air Force? And let's start with the Western Front.
This aggressive maritime posturing realized India's new maritime strategy of taking operational offensive, attacking Karachi, enticing the Pakistani fleet to battle, and most importantly, cutting the sea lines of communication between West and East Pakistan. Now, war broke out when the Pakistani Air Force carried out a counter-air strike on our airfields in the West on the evening of the 3rd of December. The Navy swung into action. It already had its Western Fleet in the North Arabian Sea and a special task group intended for missile attacks waiting off the Saurashtra coast. This task group comprised of 2 Petya-class corvettes and 4 missile boats. The idea of this task group was to approach Karachi during dark hours, launch missiles with a range of about 40 kilometers, and withdraw outside Pakistani Air Force range before dawn. 3 of the 4 missile boats, namely Nirghat, Nipat, and Veer, and the 2 escorting Petya-class ships Kachal and Kiltan, proceeded towards Karachi. Operation Trident, as it was called, the missile attack on ships at anchor and shore targets in Karachi, was underway. Now, at the predetermined range, which was about 150 nautical miles from Karachi, the missile boats were unleashed in dark. They closed Karachi at full speed to launch their missiles. This daring raid, the first of its kind, resulted in the sinking of Pakistani naval ship Muhafiz, a minesweeper, Pakistani naval ship Khyber, a destroyer, a merchant vessel MV Venus Challenger off Karachi. One missile also set fire to some tanks of the Kiamari oil refinery. The task was done and the boats charged back at maximum speed to rejoin their escorts, the Petyas, as per plan. This unique raid at the very start of the war on the 4th of December had the effect of capitulating the major part of Pakistani naval threat emanating out of Karachi. The Navy sustained the momentum by following up with Operation Python on the night of 8th of December, which caused further destruction of Pakistani assets. In this operation, involving missile attacks by INS Vinash and gun assaults by INS Trishul and INS Talwar, a merchant vessel, the MV Gulf Star, was sunk. The Kiamari oil field was once again set ablaze, and Pakistani naval ship Dhaka, which was an oil tanker, and MV Harmatan, a merchant ship, were severely damaged. The magnitude of devastation was so large and unexpected that the Pakistan Navy withdrew all its ships after this attack inside Karachi harbour and ordered reduction of ammunition outfit on all ships, both things unheard of amongst militaries across the world. Thus, the maritime war on the Western Front was effectively over within 5 days of commencement of hostilities. These 2 historic operations, Trident and Python, have been deeply etched in the memories of the nation and have been commemorated for almost 5 decades. The 4th of December has since been celebrated as the Navy Day in India. The subsequent burning of its oil fields for almost a week was aptly described as the biggest bonfire in the Arabian Sea by Admiral Nanda in his autobiography, The Man Who Bombed Karachi. Now, in all this, meticulous planning at various echelons, months of exercises and trials to hone skills, as well as spirited execution by the missile boat squadron went a long way in ensuring success of the 2 operations. It is also essential to acknowledge the strong political backing which this audacious plan received. Many aspects of the attacks were novel. The use of missiles in the region for the first time, resorting to towing by bigger ships to overcome the limitation of endurance of these boats, ingenious methods of communication to remain undetected, and using Soviet-made missile boats meant for coastal defense in an offensive role. By the way, it was perhaps the first time that the Navy had used polypropylene and nylon ropes instead of the laid-down norm of cumbersome steel wires or cables for towing ships. This had been an outcome of the experiment carried out during their maiden voyage under tow from Calcutta to Mumbai earlier that year, when they had just arrived from the Soviet Union. What was most gratifying to note was the Soviets, even as late as the 80s and 90s, showed admiration for our innovative and daredevil ideas in use of these Osa-class missile boats. They confessed that even they had never thought of towing the boats short of endurance range in order to use them at high speed within the limiting radius, as also to launch missiles to hit oil farms ashore, whereas the missiles were meant for surface-to-surface warfare. Now, the Western Fleet dominated the Arabian Sea and exercised sea control in its totality.
Now let's turn to the east and look at the map. This is where present-day Bangladesh is, erstwhile East Pakistan. On three sides, it is surrounded by the states of West Bengal. In the north, it has Meghalaya and Assam, and to its east, it has Assam and Tripura. In the south, it has its main ports of Chittagong and Cox's Bazar. And you have the river Meghna and Padma getting into the Bay of Bengal, which is where the Navy operated. What did the Navy set out to do in the east?
See, the Navy's overall concept of operation centered on taking the offensive on both the seaboards, west as well as the east. Institute contraband control. Actually, the Navy had planned to declare a blockade. It did declare a blockade on the 4th of December morning, but by that evening, it had rescinded its order because it has legalities involved and the government was a little sensitive that it should not appear as if we are the ones who initiated the war. We instituted what is called contraband control and cut off the enemy's lines of communication was the main aim. The capstone strategy in the east, which was the focus of the entire war, was to seek action, destroy the enemy in his ports, strangle supply lines to Chittagong, Cox's Bazar and the Chalna, Khulna, Mongla River port complex, which are the lifeblood for survival of not only the army but the rest of the civil population. This was to be achieved by attacking these ports from the sea. To achieve effective contraband control instead of a blockade, an under surveillance triangle of 18,000 square nautical miles was to be established with its apex at the coast of Bangladesh, that is East Pakistan, in the North Bay of Bengal.
So how did these objectives, these strategic objectives, convert to hard action?
To achieve these objectives, a concurrent, multi-pronged action plan was adopted. Now, the Eastern Fleet, which was actually kept off the Andaman Islands, unknown to the rest of the world, charged from the Andaman Sea at the right time and unleashed the Vikrant on 4th December onwards on East Pakistan. The carrier Vikrant closed in on Cox's Bazar and dispatched a strike of 8 Sea Hawks and bombed the airfield. In the afternoon of the same day, that is 4th December, the Hawks again struck the heavily defended Chittagong harbour, which was the main harbour, and the Chittagong airfield, and damaged a number of ships in the harbour. In the attack, the harbour control tower at Chittagong was damaged, one fuel dump was set ablaze, 2 gunboats were sunk, and 2 merchant ships were badly damaged. The following day, that is 5th December, newer targets were engaged in Dohazari, Chalna, Khulna and Mongla harbours. Throughout the operation, the Alize, which were actually anti-submarine warfare aircraft on the Vikrant, they too carried out bombing attacks, as also many recce sorties or reconnaissance sorties, both for the sake of the Sea Hawks, for their own raids, and for the Eastern Fleet's picture compilation. All enemy ships around Chittagong harbour or approaches were struck and incapacitated. In total, about 57,000 tons of merchant shipping, apart from Pakistani naval ships Jessore, Komila and Sylhet, were neutralized, destroyed or sunk during these deadly air operations from the aircraft carrier. The Eastern Fleet truly and effectively dominated the Bay of Bengal as it wreaked havoc on East Pakistan. Continuous airstrikes by the carrier's aircraft resulted in heavy bombardment of Pakistani cities such as Chittagong, Cox's Bazaar, Khulna, Chalna and Mongla. Vikrant was not only the game changer, but the decisive factor in this war and the linchpin of maritime operations on the eastern seaboard. Secondly, a long-term plan that predated the war by over 9 months involving training the Muktibahani was implemented. It may be worth noting that the effort to assist the Muktibahani was even declared in the Indian Parliament well before the war broke out. The plan initially revolved around creating a force of about 400 naval commandos for the upcoming state of Bangladesh and frogmen and many guerrillas through 3 months of training with additional training to leaders. All this was done in Plassey in West Bengal. The nucleus of these commandos was built around a core of Bengali sailors of the Pakistani Navy who had deserted from the third Daphne-class submarine Mangrove being built in France, joined by some other Bengalis who had been dismissed from the Pakistani Navy and a couple of merchant navy seamen. Until mid-1971, the Muktibahani was really not able to prevent the Pakistani army from exercising the harsh control that they were at. But during the monsoon months and thereafter, they reaped many successes. After rigorous training, which included the ability to swim up to 12 nautical miles in darkness in open waters, these frogmen were finally able to succeed in sabotage against communication infrastructure and ships in harbor, inland ports, ferries, pontoons, navigational buoyage in channels, and all types of vessels with their limpet mines which these frogmen were carrying in hand. Their ranks quickly proliferated from the 400 that I mentioned initially with passage of days, and the initial figure expanded to a couple of thousands by the autumn of 1971. On occasions, the Pakistan Army had even chased some of the Muktibahani groups into Indian territory to destroy their camps. Yet, the Muktibahani carried on with its tasks and complemented the actions of the Eastern Fleet in the main seaports and the riverine port complexes. In another very special and daring operation on 9th and 10th December 1971, Force Alpha, as it was secretly called, a task force comprising of patrol craft INS Panvel, gunboats Padma and Palash, and a BSF craft named Chitrangada, sailed into the backwaters of East Pakistan to carry out a raid on Chalna, Khulna and Mongla. Padma and Palash, interestingly, were loaned by the West Bengal government, jointly manned by Indian Naval and Muktibahani personnel, had been retrofitted with L-60 Bofors guns, machine guns on their bridges, and had their decks strengthened. Chitrangada was an Indian BSF patrol craft and had only machine guns. The Force Alpha had departed on the morning of the 7th of December from Hasnabad, a river port on the Indian side, and traversed several miles in the Sundarbans Delta. And their passage was undertaken in the unfamiliar, narrow and complicated waterways of the Sundarbans, at times in pitch dark conditions. An hour past midnight of 8-9 December 1971, when Force Alpha was at Akram Point in the mouth of the Pusur River, Panvel detected 2 medium-sized ships fleeing the war zone. As these vessels had greater speed than Panvel and were out of range of the force's guns, the force commander of Force Alpha relayed information about them to the Eastern Fleet operating in the Bay of Bengal. This is what had led to the Pakistani merchant ships MV Bakir and MV Anwar Baksh being apprehended by the Eastern Fleet. These ships were carrying Pakistani military personnel and their families and large quantities of weapons and ammunition. They were taken as prize of war by the Indian Navy. This daring deep penetration strike led by Force Alpha resulted in highly successful attacks on crucial riverine enemy ports. Lastly, on 15th December, an amphibious assault was conducted at Cox's Bazaar, which had been leased by the Indian Navy. This amphibious task force in a joint operation landed Romeo Force, consisting of 1-3 Gorkha Rifles, 2 companies of 11 Bihar, the 881 Light Battery, an ambulance platoon, and an ASC detachment. These forces effectively cordoned off the southern approaches from East Pakistan, thus precluding the possibility of the enemy's escape and achieving a decisive strategic advantage.
So that leads me to the mother, as she was called, INS Vikrant, our first aircraft carrier. She played a grand role during the war. And at the same time, she was threatened by the Pakistan Navy submarine Ghazi. Now, Ghazi has an interesting story for the viewers. Ghazi was acquired from the United States Navy. And before she became the Ghazi, she was called the Diablo, which in Spanish means the devil. So what was the story of the Vikrant and the Ghazi?
Okay, a good question. This was a critically important incident which materially dented the strength and fighting ability and the morale of the Pakistan Navy. It was the sinking of the main submarine in their submarine stable called Ghazi. Actually, to give Pakistan his due, it must be first admitted that despite all of the weaknesses in their navy, they did have a strong submarine arm. With an ex-American Navy French-class submarine named as PNS Ghazi and 3 ultra-modern French Daphne-class submarines. They also possessed a few chariots and midgets, miniature submersibles that could have wreaked havoc in our harbors and naval bases had they been effectively deployed by Pakistan. Of this entire stable of their submarine arm, the Ghazi was sailed by the enemy to be off Visakhapatnam, as the enemy knew that Vikrant was being based there during the war. So she was sent off Visakhapatnam before the outbreak of hostilities. Her sole mission was to sink the carrier Vikrant and cause irreparable material and psychological damage to India. Fortunately for us, the Navy had been educated to never keep her warships and particularly capital ships in harbor whenever hostilities were assessed to be imminent. The Eastern Naval Command used a novel way to entice and deceive the Ghazi. Indian naval ship Rajput, a destroyer which had actually been decommissioned, was resurrected and effectively used as a decoy. She was ordered to masquerade as Vikrant at lower revolutions on her engines in order to mislead the Ghazi and carry out anti-submarine attacks off Visakhapatnam harbor, where the Ghazi was suspected to be. The ploy worked. The sinking of Ghazi can be attributed to a clever combination of deception, operational maneuver, close-coast anti-submarine warfare, and attacks by the Rajput that led the Pakistani submarine to her doom, while the carrier and the rest of the Eastern Fleet were merrily operating unknown to the rest of the world far away off the Andaman Islands. The Ghazi exploded even before then Indian Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi delivered her historic address to the nation on All India Radio on the 3rd of December 1971. Something most importantly needs to be recounted here is the background of INS Rajput. As I said, the ship had actually been decommissioned well before the war and sent to Visakhapatnam for disposal as scrap. With the war becoming imminent, she was rejuvenated locally within the workshops of what was then only a naval base, yet to become Eastern Naval Command, and tasked for patrol duty. This is a story of unique deception and attack planned by the CNC of the Eastern Naval Command, while the Vikrant was strategically maneuvering farther east. I highlighted this episode as a critical inflection point because the Ghazi was dispatched by the Pakistan Navy with the sole aim of hitting the carrier. Had she been able to torpedo the Vikrant, the story and war matrix of 1971 would have been very, very different indeed. The Indian Navy's advanced planning of quietly moving the Eastern Fleet far away off the Andamans before the war and of using decoys reap masterly outcomes.
So we have all heard about the USS Enterprise, which came into our waters during the 1971 operations. So what was the story and how was it held back?
Actually, this makes a great story of geopolitics of the day. Before the 10th of December, world reaction to the war was one of hope, hinging on America to secure a ceasefire through the United Nations. The situation in the east was much worse, and so the Pakistani army made its first tentative attempt to obtain a ceasefire. But the UN effort was stalled by the Soviet veto. In fact, the Soviet Union had twice exercised its veto in the Security Council in India's favor on the same day, the 5th of December. On its part, America was getting very concerned about saving West Pakistan from disaster. There was uncertainty in American minds whether India intended to shift her troops from east to west and decisively defeat Pakistan. Pushed to a corner, Pakistan invoked a secret agreement with the US, whereby America had promised to come to her aid if and when attacked by India. So to keep the treaty commitments, the US ordered a naval task group called Naval Task Group 74, comprising of the USS Enterprise, an aircraft carrier, an amphibious assault ship, 4 guided missile destroyers, a guided missile frigate, and a landing ship to sail from the Gulf of Tonkin in the Western Pacific towards the Bay of Bengal. Though the Enterprise Task Group had transited through the Malacca Strait on 14th December, already too late, but instead of heading towards East Pakistan, it shaped course towards Sri Lanka, which was actually perplexing. Next day, it was officially stated in Washington that after the ceasefire, the Enterprise Group might help evacuate Pakistani troops from the east. Given that over 90,000 Pakistani troops were in the east, while the task group had room for a maximum of just 2,000 or 3,000 extra bodies for a short voyage. Unfortunately for the two allies in the US and Pakistan, things did not in any case work towards coercion of India, as the Pakistani armed forces in the east surrendered on the 16th of December. Though I must say, in India, the spectrum of reactions to the Enterprise Task Group had ranged from public indignation at American gunboat diplomacy, as it were called, to poise at the highest political level, which was in the long term very satisfying to see. In January 1972, the Enterprise Task Group left the Indian Ocean. The obvious question that arises is, why did the Enterprise not shape course towards East Pakistan, which was the initial intention? The answer lies in a very interesting chapter of the day. Apart from ordering the Enterprise Task Group to the Bay of Bengal, President Nixon had also sent a letter the same day to the Soviet chairman Leonid Brezhnev. Apart from ordering the Enterprise Group to the Bay of Bengal, President Nixon had also sent a letter the same day to the Soviet chairman Leonid Brezhnev, urging Russia to join America in a combined appeal for a complete ceasefire. It was on that occasion that the US President also informed the Russian leadership that America had a secret treaty commitment to support Pakistan against Indian aggression, and that American naval forces had started moving towards East Pakistan. So why did the Enterprise Group change course despite all this? The reason was very interesting. Countermarking, as it is called in naval parlance, by a Soviet naval force which had included nuclear-powered attack submarines, or SSNs in naval terminology. When the war had begun, the USSR already had a small force on station as an incumbent Indian Ocean flotilla comprising of 2 destroyers and 2 minesweepers and a tanker. But on 6th December, a 3-ship Soviet naval force, including a missile cruiser, had left Vladivostok. And on the 13th December, yet a second task force comprising of 4 ships, including a missile cruiser and missile destroyer, were also dispatched. So the two Cold War opponents kept circling each other well south of the scene of action, that is East Pakistan or North Bay of Bengal. That is, they remained off the east coast of Sri Lanka. This drama continued till well into the first week of January 1972. Neither did the Enterprise Group close East Pakistan for rescuing the Pakistani troops, nor was the excuse of evacuation of US citizens, also made at one stage, credulous enough, as they had already been rescued by the British Naval Task Force, which was leaving the Indian Ocean.
So the Indian Navy integrated with the Indian Army and Air Force to ensure that the war ended in 16 days. And the Vikrant played a very important role in that war. What were the strategic implications of the performance of INS Vikrant in 1971 on the Navy, and in particular with respect to aircraft carriers and the future of naval aviation? Because this was a swivel moment.
If you look at the 71 war and the period that has passed since then, history now stands testimony to the fact that Vikrant's aircraft not only hit many vital targets on shore, damaged many a ship in harbor or at approaches to Chittagong, but most importantly, the carrier had instilled fear in the enemy, which had substantial adverse effects on the morale of the Pakistani troops. Above all, Vikrant and her aircraft ensured that no supply could reach the enemy by sea. The only escape route by sea was totally cut off. The fleet air arm and the art of operating a light aircraft carrier in offensive role gave birth to the confidence in the Indian Navy that a carrier can and must be used in future in support of power projection, which was what was actually done in 1971, and obtain effective sea control.
So I would like to go back to the Western Command and an incident which involved Pakistan naval ship Hangor, which was a submarine deployed around Bombay. And that story is really interesting. Why don't you tell us that story?
True. Now, this would be from a recollection of Pakistani chronicles under the name The Story of the Pakistan Navy. It was a book written after the war got over. And this is how the story of Pakistan Navy narrates the incident. They say that PNS Hangor had slipped in the early hours of 22nd November 1971 for a patrol off the Indian Kathiawar coast, which is off the Saurashtra coast. On the 23rd of November, when a state of emergency was declared in Pakistan by its president, Hangor was off Porbandar, very close to the Indian coast because these are deep waters. On 1st December, she received orders directing her to shift to a patrol area of Bombay, which had been vacated by PNS Mangro and other Daphne class on completion of her patrol. So Hangor was on the surface on the night of 2nd December off Bombay, when at about 20 minutes before midnight on the 2nd-3rd night, a large formation of ships was detected on her radar on an easterly bearing about 35 nautical miles away. Such abnormal detection ranges on a submarine's radar are frequently obtained in this area in the winter months due to what is called anomalous propagation of electromagnetic waves, which results from the trapping of radio waves and electromagnetic waves of radars in ducts formed due to temperature inversions over the sea. The Hangor closed this formation to a range of 26 nautical miles at about 50 minutes after midnight on the 3rd of December, when she dived to a depth of 40 meters and tracked the ships on her sonar till the early hours of the morning of 3rd December. A quick sweep by her radar at periscope depth revealed that the formation consisted of 6 escorts screening a main body of 4 Western Fleet ships comprising the cruiser Mysore with supporting auxiliaries and her escorts which had sailed from Bombay on 2nd December. At this time, though an all-out war was raging in East Pakistan already, as per this book, The Story of the Pakistan Navy, hostilities had not broken out in the West. So Hangor, as per the Pakistan Navy, could not attack these ships as she did not have clearance to do so, which was a fact. It was not until 0820 hours on the morning of the 4th of December, one day later, that Hangor learnt about the outbreak of hostilities. And this message was received from the Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Navy on the submarine broadcast, and frustration and disappointment at missing their prey by such a narrow margin was great for the commanding officer and the crew of Hangor. Now, that is what the story of Pakistan Navy said. It seems to be quite accurate, but it must be clarified here that firstly, the Pakistani Daphnes carried French torpedoes that could be expected to traverse a maximum range of 14 kilometers or 7.5 nautical miles. So at 26 nautical miles, where the fleet was last left by the radar, the Pakistani submarine Hangor could not have been able to hit the Mysore group. Even under the present technology, only heavyweight torpedoes of today can reach a maximum range of about 50 kilometers, which is about 27 nautical miles. And those torpedoes did not exist at that time. Secondly, the approaches to Mumbai harbour and even south and north of Mumbai are so shallow because of topography of the area that they are unfriendly to submarines. By the way, the Saurashtra coast and northwards right up to the Makran coast of Pakistan are naturally deep and therefore very friendly to submarines. So you see, the situation would be the other way around, that off the Pakistani coast and off our Saurashtra coast, an enemy's submarine would find easy haven to carry out an attack, but not off Bombay.
So there's another part of the 1971 war which most people are not aware of, which is the role the Indian Navy played in Bangladesh after the war to clean up the mines, the bridges, the sunken ships, which happened as damage during the war, and that role is often forgotten. What happened at that time?
True. Very few people know that in the early months of formation of Muktibahani, its frogmen had laid mines across the entrance to the Pusur River, which led to the riverine port complexes inside, where a lot of ships used to go. 3 merchant ships and a Pakistani gunboat had sunk or run aground as a result of mine explosions, blocking the navigational channel in the Pusur River. Then just prior to surrendering, the Pakistan Navy had smartly laid a large minefield in the approaches to Chittagong harbour, knowing that they would now have no alternative but to surrender. So they did not want Indian forces to utilize their own harbours. The shipping traffic had also ceased coming into their ports. To help restore maritime activity in Bangladesh, therefore, as early as possible, then Indian Navy established what were called naval advisory groups to work in close collaboration with the Army's Eastern Command and the civil affairs group established by Army headquarters in Bangladesh. The task of these 3 organizations were to reopen Bangladesh ports for resumption of seaborne trade, clearance of wrecks in harbours and rivers, restoration of navigational aids, including buoys and lights, and rehabilitation of port facilities like control towers, jetties, cranes, etc. were involved. And by 3rd January, most of the damaged infrastructure like cranes, water supplies, jetties, port control tower had been restored.
So the story of INS Vikrant, which went down.
On the west coast, a Pakistani Daphne-class submarine Mangro was detected through sonar, direction-finding signals of her communications, and visual sightings of her snot by aircraft off Diu. The 14th Frigate Squadron, comprising Kukri and Kirpan, were detailed to prosecute the Pakistani submarine. Unfortunately, while Kukri was attempting to obtain finer contact detection to prosecute this submarine contact, the Pakistani submarine launched a serial torpedo attack at both ships. The Kukri sank in the early hours of 9th December, while Kirpan managed to evade the torpedo fired at her. This was tragic, but was the only loss suffered amongst surface platforms, along with some precious lives, part of the crew of Kukri.
Sir, over the last 2 years, the Indian military has been speaking about theatre command and jointsmanship. But if you read the stories of the 1971 war, particularly in the Eastern Front, would you call it a great example of jointsmanship?
Of course, the best thing that was witnessed by the rank and file as well as the nation at large was exemplary demonstration of jointmanship at all levels. It flowed down from the personalities of the three chiefs. This was a result of great leadership qualities amongst them. General Manekshaw, Admiral Nanda, and Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal. We couldn't have asked for three better personalities to head the three forces. Their harmonious interactions and cooperative attitude proved infectious down the rank and file. And let us make no mistakes in our conclusions from this war. The camaraderie and accommodation of each other's role in the war at all levels is what gave us such an impressive victory.
So how would you say 1971 changed the Navy for the better?
So I must go back to what you said in the beginning, in the very first question that you asked me, that the 71 Indo-Pak proved to be the Navy's finest hour. It had been a landmark moment for a young Indian Navy, all of 21 years, if one were to take away those initial 3 years after independence as the Royal Indian Navy under a flag which included command by the British Royal Navy. One of the reasons for this satisfaction was reversal of the Navy's role vis-a-vis the 1965 war. In every conflict, there are lessons to be learnt by both the victor and the victim. The results are there for all of us to see today, as the mix of platforms in all three dimensions of the Indian Navy of today is really impressive and covers all roles and all postures.